Imagine standing on the edge of a roaring river. The water is wild, the current unstoppable, and on the other side lies your destiny, a land promised for generations, a future written by the hand of God. You can see it, almost touch it, but one impossible barrier still stands in your way, the raging Jordan River at flood stage. This wasn't just any river. It was nature's wall, a symbol of every challenge that tells us, you'll never make it through. Behind you, there's no turning back. Ahead of you, there's only fear and uncertainty. And in that very moment, God does something that defies logic, science, and human strength. He parts the river, not for a single man like Moses, but for an entire nation. The ground turns dry, the waters rise like towering walls, and the people step forward, not in fear, but in faith. This is not just an ancient miracle. It is a message for every one of us who has ever stood before a Jordan River in life. Maybe it's a dream that feels unreachable, a problem too big to solve, or a fear too heavy to carry. The story of the Jordan teaches us this: when God leads, no barrier can stand, no wall can hold, and no river can stop you from reaching your promise. Stay with me, because in the next few minutes, you'll see how this one event changed history forever, and how it holds a secret that could change your story today. And if you believe these timeless stories still matter, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss what's coming next. The sun was blazing high above the horizon as the nation of Israel stood at the edge of the Jordan River. The air was heavy, filled with the sound of rushing waters. This wasn't a quiet stream that one could step over, it was flood season, and the Jordan overflowed its banks with a roar that seemed to mock the trembling crowd. Mothers held their children close, elders leaned on their staffs, and warriors gripped their swords, but none of these things could bridge the raging water before them. Behind them lay 40 years of wandering in the wilderness. 40 years of lessons, trials, and waiting. For an entire generation, this moment had been the dream. The promised land, a place flowing with milk and honey, freedom and home, was just on the other side. Yet between them and destiny stood the impossible wall of the Jordan. Joshua, the new leader who had stepped into the shadow of Moses, walked among the people. He wasn't just carrying the weight of his own faith, he carried the hope of millions. Every eye was on him. Could he really lead them as Moses once did? Could he prove that God was still with them? Then came the instruction that defied all human logic: the priests, carrying the Ark of the Covenant, that golden chest representing God's very presence, were to step into the river first. No bridges, no boats, no shortcuts. Just feet stepping into chaos with nothing but faith to hold them. Imagine the scene. The river raged louder as the priests lifted the ark high upon their shoulders. Every step they took toward the water was a declaration that God was greater than the impossible. People whispered, hearts pounded, and children clung tighter to their parents. The moment the soles of the priests' feet touched the Jordan's surface, something unimaginable began to happen. The waters, mighty and unstoppable, suddenly froze. Not in ice, but in power. The rushing flow halted as though an invisible hand held it back. The river gathered into a towering wall far upstream, while the ground beneath the priests turned dry. Dry. Not muddy, not damp, but solid as if the river had never been there at all. Gasps spread through the crowd. Eyes widened in disbelief, then in awe. This was not nature. This was not coincidence. This was the power of the Almighty, opening a doorway where no doorway had ever existed. And as the priests stood firm with the ark in the middle of that dry riverbed, the nation of Israel began to cross. One by one, family by family, they stepped onto the impossible path that had been made possible. With each step, the fear of the river faded, replaced with faith that their God truly was with them. That day, the Jordan was not just parted. Fear itself was parted. Doubt was drowned. And a new chapter of destiny began as the first families stepped onto the dry riverbed. Silence fell over the entire camp. No one dared to speak too loudly, for this was not an ordinary crossing. Every sound of sandals scraping against the hardened earth echoed like thunder in their hearts. The priests remained in the center, unmoving, carrying the Ark of the Covenant high on their shoulders. Its golden surface gleamed with divine light, a reminder that it was not human strength holding back the waters, it was God Himself. Picture the sight: on one side, a wall of water stretched high into the sky, frozen in place. On the other side, the empty riverbed extended like a golden highway into the promised land. For years, the people had heard stories of what God did through Moses at the Red Sea. But this was different. This was happening before their very eyes. Their children were seeing a miracle with their own feet planted firmly on dry ground. Among the crowd, an old man who had once been a child at the crossing of the Red Sea leaned on his staff and whispered, "He has done it again. The God of Moses is the God of Joshua." His words spread like fire through the people, filling them with courage. But it wasn't just about getting to the other side. God gave Joshua a command, one that would ensure this miracle would never be forgotten. 12 men, one from each tribe of Israel, were chosen to carry stones from the middle of the Jordan. Huge stones, heavy enough to test their strength. These weren't souvenirs. They were memorials, reminders for generations to come that when the people faced the impossible, their God opened the way. As the last of the people crossed safely, Joshua stood at the river's edge, watching history unfold. He knew this wasn't just about reaching a destination. It was about building a faith strong enough to carry them into battles ahead, into victories and struggles they couldn't yet imagine. This moment was a bridge not only into land, but into identity. They were no longer wanderers. They were no longer slaves. They were the people of promise, stepping boldly into destiny. Then, when everyone had crossed, the priests carefully stepped out of the dry riverbed. The instant their feet touched the other bank, the wall of water collapsed with a roar, crashing back into its place. The Jordan flowed once again as if nothing had ever happened. But for those who crossed, nothing would ever be the same. The people looked back one last time at the roaring river. Their children pointed at the stones now stacked into a towering memorial. And Joshua declared that this day would be remembered forever, the day God parted the Jordan, the day faith triumphed over fear, the day a nation walked into its inheritance. This was not just history. It was destiny unfolding before their eyes as the people crossed. Something remarkable happened. This was not just about reaching the other side, it was about transformation. For 40 years, they had lived as wanderers, surviving from day to day, always waiting for someday. But now, as their feet touched the dry riverbed, they were no longer wanderers. They were becoming conquerors, heirs of a promise older than themselves. Picture the moment: the Ark of the Covenant stood in the center, held steady by the priests. Its golden surface gleamed in the sunlight, radiating the reminder that this was not human strength, but divine power. Every family that passed by looked at it with tears, whispers of prayers, and renewed courage. Children tugged on their parents' robes, pointing with wide eyes at the towering wall of water that had stopped in obedience to their God. It was a living miracle. Each step across that river was a declaration: we belong to Him, and He will fight for us. The young warriors who had grown up in the wilderness began to see themselves not as children of slaves but as sons of destiny. The elders who had seen the Red Sea part decades earlier felt the confirmation that the same God who opened the way back then was still opening the way now. And when the last of the people had crossed, Joshua gave a command that turned this event into a permanent testimony. 12 men, one from each tribe, were to go back into the riverbed and take 12 stones, large, heavy, and unforgettable. They carried them out and stacked them on the other side, building a monument that would never fade. Why? Because this story was not meant for that generation alone. One day, children would point to those stones and ask, "What do they mean?" And the answer would echo for centuries: this is where the Lord cut off the Jordan before us. This is where He made a way when there was no way. This is the proof that God is faithful. The stones weren't just rocks. They were memories carved into history. They stood as silent witnesses that when faith and obedience meet, miracles happen. But the miracle of the Jordan was not only about geography, it was about identity. For years, this nation had lived with the memory of Egypt on their backs, the whips of taskmasters, the chains of slavery, and the endless wandering in a desert that seemed to have no end. Crossing the Jordan was not just stepping into new land, it was stepping into a new future. Imagine the silence the moment the last stone was set on the other side. The waters, which had stood still like mighty walls, suddenly crashed back into place with a roar that echoed through the valley. The river surged again, unstoppable, and for anyone who came later, it would look as if nothing had ever happened. But for those who crossed, life would never be the same. They looked back and realized, the wilderness was behind them forever. There was no going back. The God who had carried them through the impossible was now calling them forward into battles, blessings, and promises. The crossing of the Jordan was the line in the sand, or rather, the line in the water. Behind them was wandering. Ahead of them was destiny. And here lies the deeper truth: every generation faces a Jordan. A point where faith is tested, where fear whispers, "You can't," but God declares, "I will." The river represents the barrier between who you have been and who you are called to be. Some never take that step. But those who trust, those who move forward, find that the waters of impossibility part in ways they could never have imagined. The people of Israel stepped onto the soil of the promised land not because they were strong enough, but because God was faithful enough. And that is the lesson that echoes across time: your greatest victories are not earned by your power, but by His presence. As Joshua stood on the threshold of the promised land, a new chapter in the history of God's people was about to unfold. The wilderness was behind them, the Jordan River was before them, and the land of Canaan, filled with mighty cities and fierce warriors, lay ahead. To many, it seemed impossible. They had no armies like their enemies, no fortified walls, and no weapons of mass destruction. But what they did have was infinitely greater: the presence of God Himself. This moment was not just about land or conquest, it was about identity. For years, the Israelites had wandered in the desert, shaped by trials, purified through failures, and strengthened by victories. Now, God was calling them to rise, to claim the inheritance promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. It was the ultimate test of trust, not in human strength, but in divine power. The first great obstacle was Jericho, a city so fortified that its walls seemed unbreakable. From a human perspective, it was an impossible fortress. But God's ways are not human ways. Joshua received strange instructions: to march around the city once a day for 6 days, and on the 7th day, to march 7 times, then blow the trumpets, and shout. No siege engines. No swords. No ladders. Just faith and obedience. Imagine the scene: thousands of men, women, and children walking silently around the towering walls of Jericho while the enemy mocked them from above. Day after day, they obeyed without seeing results. Then came the 7th day. The horns blasted, the people shouted with all their strength, and the walls of Jericho crumbled like sand before a storm. This victory was not just military, it was spiritual. It showed that God was the true warrior leading His people. The fall of Jericho echoed through history, a reminder that no wall, no enemy, and no obstacle can stand against the will of the Almighty. The Israelites entered Canaan, not as a lost tribe of wanderers, but as a nation chosen, guided, and empowered by God. And that, my friends, is the lesson of Joshua's conquest: when faith leads the way, the impossible becomes possible. And so, the story of Joshua is not just about battles won or cities conquered, it's about faith that breaks barriers, courage that defies logic, and a God who proves that no wall is too high, no enemy too strong, and no promise too far. The conquest of Jericho was more than a victory, it was a declaration that when you walk with God, the impossible bends before you. Think about it: how many walls stand in your own life right now? Walls of fear, doubt, failure, or hopelessness. Just as the Israelites circled Jericho in faith, you too are being called to march around your obstacles with trust, perseverance, and obedience. And when the time is right, those walls will crumble. Because the God who split the sea, who thundered on Sinai, and who brought down Jericho's gates is still the same today. This is the heartbeat of the sacred path, not just ancient history, but timeless truth. Stories that don't just tell us about the past but challenge us to live with faith in the present. If this journey stirred your soul, then don't just scroll away. Stay with us. Subscribe to the Sacred Path, hit that bell icon, and be part of this growing family of seekers walking together through the most powerful,